Esteemed guests, the program is about to begin. Thank you. Esteemed guests, please welcome President Lee C. Bollinger and our program participants.
So I'd like to acknowledge some people first. Provost Mary Boyce, the Executive Vice President for University Life, Dennis Mitchell. I would like to thank and recognize the co-sponsors for this event, the Office of University Life, the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and the Harriman Institute. I would also like to thank our moderator and our speakers, Professor Lisa Anderson, Steve Coll, Dean of the Journalism School, Alexander Cooley, a senior research scholar in the Harriman Institute, former Ambassador Valerii Kuchynskyi, and Professor Keren Milo. On February 24th, Russian troops began an unprovoked assault on Ukraine in violation of international law and human conscience. The attacks since then have been harrowing and brutal. Cities have been bombarded, many have been killed. Reports have emerged of strikes on civilian targets. Civilians along evacuation routes have been prevented from escaping and even killed by Russian forces. In all, more than 1.5 million refugees have fled. In Russia, dissent is being silenced and disinformation is rampant. Thousands of citizens have been arrested for peaceful demonstrations against the war. Officials have blocked access to social media and major news outlets. Lawmakers have approved legislation that threatens prison for coverage that is critical of the invasion, causing media companies to suspend operations and stop broadcasting in the country. Throughout all of this, the world has witnessed the bravery, agility, and persistence of the Ukrainian people and their president, Volodymyr Zelensky. In the face of overwhelming odds, they have mounted a stiff defense against the Russian forces. And they have managed to unite the West and much of the world in ways that many had thought impossible not long ago. Cooperation across borders and economies has been remarkable. Just two quick comments, one about Colombia and the other dimension about my own field of freedom of speech and press. At Columbia, we have been doing our best to support our Russian and Ukrainian students and others who have been affected by this war through the Office of University Life and the International Students and Scholars Office. Last week, we announced plans to expand our initiative for students and scholars displaced by the crisis in Afghanistan to those fleeing the war in Ukraine. Our faculty experts are available to those in government and the private sector to help. They have also been explaining what's happening to the public and debating the news as it happens in their classrooms. We have also been hosting events like this one in order to make sense of what is going on, to understand what is at stake, and to figure out what more we can do as this crisis continues to evolve. For sure, every area of human endeavor will be affected by this ongoing travesty on the world stage. So it will be in my own field. I can say now at least this. In that famously seminal era following the Second World War, when so much of the framework of modern international life was imagined and established, one critical pillar of that period was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Article 19 of that treaty articulated for the world the fundamental right of freedom of expression in strong and eloquent terms. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Over the decades, this has entered the arena of international law and generated similar protections in regional and other conventions and treaties. What bears repeating now is that one of the central meanings of Article 19 was the belief that we all have a collective and shared interest in stopping individual nations from suppressing and censoring speech and press, because local censorship is rarely contained. The issues or the lesson of World War II was that local censorship is but a prelude to even greater aggression towards other nations, and therefore a risk to peace and broader human rights everywhere. It is a tragedy, of course, that we have had to learn that lesson all over again. Please join me now in welcoming our panel for what I'm sure will be a probing discussion. They are led by moderator Lisa Anderson, the James T. Shotwell Professor Emerita of International Relations and Dean Emerita of the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Lisa is an expert on state formation and regime change. Lisa, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be joining President Bollinger in showcasing the depth of Columbia's concern about the world around us and the breadth of the talent that we can mobilize to help us understand it. The force and violence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the intensity of the international condemnation, and the strength of Ukrainian resistance has surprised us all. Clearly, Ukraine, Russia itself, and the world as a whole will bear enormous costs, more no doubt than anyone expected. Here to explore how we got where we are, why we might have been surprised as we've been, and what the implications for the future may be, are four extraordinarily well-qualified fellow Colombians. And let me tell you a little bit about each of them before I invite them to comment. As President Bollinger said, Stephen Coll is the Dean of the Columbia Journal, and he is also a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's published several books on the reach and limits of American power and foreign policy, notably in Afghanistan. Alex Cooley is professor of political science at Barnard College and the former head of the Harriman Institute on the study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. He's written a number of books, including Dictators Without Borders and Exit from Hegemony, The Unraveling of the American Global Order. Valerii Kuchynskyi is adjunct professor of international and public affairs and former permanent representative of the Ukraine to the United Nations. He's a career diplomat, serving not only in the Foreign Service of the Ukraine, including as head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Department, but also within the United Nations itself. And Keren Yarhi-Milo is director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and the Arnold A. Saltzman Professor of War and Peace Studies. Her first book, Knowing the Adversary, looks at how leaders intelligence organizations assess intentions in international relations. Her most recent work extends that research in a book called Who Fights for Reputation? The Psychology of Leaders in International Conflict. Thank you all for being with us. I'd like to break this conversation in two parts. First, what has happened and why, as far as we can tell. And in a second round, what is to be done? How can we understand, anticipate, and perhaps influence the future? So let's start with how we got here and where we are right now. And I'd like to start with Ambassador Kuchynskyi. Perhaps you can tell us in a few minutes, obviously we could spend days on this, about the current state of play in Ukraine. I plan to come back to the ambassador for the last word of the panel, but first.
Thank you very much. As we were entering the 13th day of the war, the grim news keep coming every day. A ceasefire in Mariupol and Volkhanivka, the two cities on the south of Ukraine, as a result of the war, of the bombardment, hundreds of thousands of people were trapped there in these southern cities. And their attempts to flee collapsed due to heavy bombardment on an hourly basis from the Russian side. In Mariupol, hundreds of thousands of people remained trapped without food, water, under regular bombardment from the other side. Now the Russians offered another option to Ukrainians, to the citizens of the occupied cities and to the cities under siege. There's a so-called Green Corridor from Kiev to the territory of Russia's ally Belarus, and from Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, directly to Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky called this Russian proposal absolutely unacceptable and completely immoral. Today, there have been some green passages established, and many people managed to go away from this area. So I'll enumerate a few most important facts or actions that have been taking place. Yesterday, hearings began at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, true without legal representation from Russia, which boycotted the event. In this regard, Ukraine's ambassador there said, and I quote, "The fact that Russia's seats are empty speaks loudly. They're not here in the court, but they're on the battlefield waging an aggressive war against my country." Ukraine is seeking an emergency order to halt hostilities as soon as possible, immediately, as a matter of fact. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba met on Saturday on Ukraine's border with Poland to discuss Western efforts to support Ukraine and isolate Russia. Blinken spent the whole weekend in Poland and Moldova before visiting the Baltic states, NATO members, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And the purpose was to secure and to, in fact, reassure Baltic allies who fear President Putin will not stop at Ukraine in trying to redraw the borders of Europe. After the phone call with President Putin, President Macron was convinced, and I quote, that the worst was yet to come, and that Russia wanted to take all of Ukraine. Putin called Macron on Thursday, 3rd March, in what appeared to be absolutely different from previous exchange of views between the two leaders during the previous conversations. The 90-minute call failed to deliver any diplomatic breakthrough. Before that, on Wednesday, the UN General Assembly adopted a historic resolution, a historic. 141 members voted in favor, with 35 abstentions, and only 5, Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, Syria, and Russia, voted against. The Council of Europe, the continent's main institution for governing human rights, has suspended Russia from participation. The International Criminal Court started investigation of war crimes perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. On Thursday, 4th March, NATO emergency meeting was held. Secretary General reimbursed full support of Ukraine. At the same time, he underlined that NATO was not going to ensure a no-fly zone over Ukraine, claiming, and I quote, that it was not our war. The issue of introducing a no-fly zone over Ukraine became even more urgent after the Russian forces captured Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia. The ensuing fire was extinguished. The level of radiation was not very much over the norm, but according to the Director General of the plant, the nuclear safety has been violated. Just to remind you that in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986, the world saw the consequences of the accident on only one power unit. There are 6 of them at Zaporizhzhia. So, as Ukraine's president stressed, it threatens not only Ukraine, not only Europe, but the whole world. One of the reasons, by the way, why, and this is extremely important, why no-fly zone over Ukraine will be introduced by Western alliance is the fear that it would lead to direct confrontation between the US and Russia, which the US has managed to avoid for the last 75 years by diplomatic means. Ukraine is ready to close the skies by its own means. There were several important visits to Ukraine. President Zelensky practically every day or even twice a day addresses the nation and explains the current situation. To end, I will give you the latest figures of the losses of Russian forces, Russian losses in Ukraine. Up to 12,000 personnel lost their lives, 48 aircraft, 80 helicopters, 303 tanks were destroyed, and so on. So definitely the losses are really great. Just to, let's say, to finish up, I would say that the Ukrainian army has demonstrated its strength, its ability to rebuff the aggressor. And I am personally absolutely sure that the aggressor will be rebuffed, destroyed, and punished. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Keren, I'd like to talk a little about this aggressor, if I may, or have you. So what, as you think about Putin, what were his motivations? How was he thinking about what he was about to do? And what kind of things does psychology help us with in understanding that?
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, this is definitely the real question of the day as we try to figure out what drove Putin to do this. The question about his motivation is not just a philosophical question, it's one that we really have to wrestle with because it gives us important clues as to what he might do next, how we could possibly end this. And so far, we've been hearing three narratives about what drove him. And I'll lay them out for you and tell you the issues with each one of them and then what I think is really going on. So the first one is that Putin's behavior is centered on his own personal ambition to revive Russia's previous global status as a superpower and punish Ukraine for its historical, for its betrayal by voting for independence in 1991, right? We know that Putin is obsessed with history. And this perspective really implies that he's operating in a domain of loss, this kind of status deficit, that what we know from research that leads leaders as well, to be even more risk tolerant, to take excessive risk, to regain losses. And if this is really his state of mind, then it tells us that this is definitely will escalate further. People use and cite his presentation as kind of rationale for invading Ukraine as kind of in line with this. Obviously, he looked like a madman. I would say not so fast. There is also this kind of strategic presentation of a madman that he might have thought would give him some leverage. But there are some issues with this explanation, which is really about the timing of the invasion, why now, that, this doesn't get us fully into kind of why we're seeing what we're seeing right now. The second explanation that is out there and is gaining in popularity, you've heard it from political scientists even before the invasion of Ukraine. And this is a very different kind of interpretation that looks at Putin as acting out of fear and insecurity. And that's the argument about NATO's expansion. And here is basically the argument goes since the end of the Cold War, he's watched as the NATO alliances has expanded and integrated one ex-Soviet republic after the other. We have the 2008 declaration, announcement of Georgia and Ukraine would become future members. And this obviously put, in his perspective, even though this was not the intention, but in his twisted lens of kind of thinking about it, this really poses risk to his regime and instability. Some would argue this is not really about NATO's expansion. It could be even the increased level of trades and between Ukraine and the European Union. And again, and here is really a perception that he's not motivated by humiliation, but really from fear and insecurity. And here, and again, you've heard this from political scientists. You hear it from Russia too. And there are some issues with that explanation as well. That obviously does not explain the timing again, and it does not explain the kind of invasion that we see. If he really just wanted to show that his red lines were credible, he did not have to go, he does not have to go all the way to Kyiv to show that this is something that he's not going to tolerate. The third and last narrative about Putin's motivation is that he's neither defensively motivated nor a very determined aggressor a la Hitler, but in fact that he really is an opportunistic actor who miscalculated. And he miscalculated in a way that breaks away from his pattern, right? We tend to think about him, and this is something we can talk about it, as very shrewd gambler, very risk-calculating leader who took some risks in Georgia, in Crimea, in Syria, but they paid off. And this time, and this is the question of why he miscalculated this time, but there were miscalculations. He obviously miscalculated the strength of his army, the reaction from the West, the unity around the sanctions. There's a lot of miscalculation. Some would argue that it's because he's increasingly isolated and manic, and the information that he's getting from his generals are ones that did not serve him well. Others will say, well, you know, how could he have predicted the West's reaction after what happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, after looking at public opinion, thinking about the midterm elections, and European countries are in this kind of migration and immigration issues. So just to conclude, neither of those narratives are not mutually exclusive. There's probably an element of truth to each one of them. They probably reinforce one another, but it's really important for us to try to figure out what is driving him, because that will tell us something about how this ends. If this is really about NATO's expansion and in sense of insecurity, then part of the solution will have to come with very clear assurances, credible assurances about the future of Ukraine. If it's really about an ambition to revive the superpower status, then it's going to get much uglier, unfortunately, and the solution is going to be much harder to find. If it's just a miscalculation, then what we should try to do at some point is try to figure out how can we let him save face and give him maybe a little bit of something to show that this was maybe miscalculation, but he can still stay in power if he thinks that that's a possibility. So anyway, all I'm saying is that those questions are frustrating and hard to answer, but it's really important for us to follow the evidence, to kind of really keep those narratives in mind, because they offer important clues as what's coming next, and this is something we can talk about.
Can I ask you a sort of follow-up question? Why is it so hard for us to interpret what someone like Putin is doing?
It's a great question, Lisa. It's incredibly difficult to get into the minds of autocratic leaders, especially when they're isolated and paranoid, and with Putin it's now more than ever. But when you have this kind of high level of uncertainty about how how an adversary is thinking, we tend to commit this fallacy that we call mirroring imaging or mirroring risks, which is where we tend to think about the adversary's cost-benefit calculation, right, of the different options, using our own sets of values, risks, costs, as opposed to really trying to think about them from his perspective. Now, this is really a part of a pattern that we see across history, throughout history, of our inability to really predict change in how autocrats behave. We all remember Hitler and how shocked we were after Munich. But this is not just the Hitler example, right? We've seen this throughout the Cold War. We failed to anticipate it when Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba, right? Thinking that why would he take such a costly action? We also had this with the invasion of Afghanistan that made Carter was shocked, and we all know what happened. This was the collapse of the ton and return to the Cold War, right? Something very similar. So we've had a concept about Putin, similar to the way the Israelis had about the Egyptian in the pre-73 war, right? And the conception was that he's a very calculated gambler and that he's not going to throw that playbook that worked so well for him. And we obviously miscalculated here. Now, why? It's an important question, and I think the pandemic made it harder. He is isolated. He is getting bad advice from his generals. That's why he's not performing the way that he thought. And we have to be very careful, because that information that he's getting from the general, the worse the situation is on the field, they're probably even more scared to tell him what's happening. which means that it doesn't really matter what's happening on the ground, but we have to figure out what information he's getting and how he's seeing his options using his own point of view. So I'm not ready to say that he's not rational, but I am increasingly concerned about his ability to update based on what's happening on the ground, which will make the solution much harder to find, and a zone of agreement much harder to find.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Alex, I'd like to go from the individual to the global.
Yeah.
All of this is taking place in a global context, and you've written and a lot about the changing global order and geopolitical shifts. How does this reflect those kinds of changes? So on the one hand, we're looking at changes perhaps in Putin's view of the world, but how does it look globally?
Yeah, I mean, think of all the changes that have happened in the last 10 days. This is an inflection point that's, absolutely critical. For some, this marks the end of the post-Cold War era. For others, this is a decisive galvanizing of the West. I see both some continuities and some discontinuities. I'll just say at first, Vladimir Putin and the Russian foreign policy establishment have always been obsessed with this idea of remaking the world order. Over 15 years now, it's in all the documents, foreign policy, defense policy. They are a revisionist power. They don't accept the rules, the norms, the decision-making procedures on which the liberal international order, US-led, exists. They talk of US hypocrisy, of double standards. And so we've tended to dismiss these complaints as being most about concerns about power or concerns about not having a free hand to remake the so-called near abroad into a neo-imperialist project. But we see the conflation of a lot of these aims in what he's trying to do in Ukraine. I think the irony of this is that if he had just stuck to recognizing the independence of the Donbass, it would have made the situation in the West even worse. Up to this, the West was perceived as impotent, divided. Extra systemic parties all over Western Europe were openly opposing and questioning the EU and NATO. There was a question of how much economic pain these countries be willing to undergo to just stand by the principle of territorial integrity if it's just Eastern Ukraine. But all of this thinking went out of the window, and we had a seismic shift, the consolidation of the West. Germany deciding all of a sudden to rearm at 2%, $100 billion fund. Every NATO country offering weapons. I was in Greece just last week when that decision was made there. Extraordinary pronouncements of support. That's just on the NATO side. Then all of a sudden, this package of economic sanctions that went way beyond anything Putin and his cohort thought. And the most significant of these is sanctioning the central bank. So Putin had amassed a war chest, over $600 billion worth in reserves, but most of that is in the form of euro and dollars. And now he has access to gold bars and also Chinese currency, which is illiquid. So that's a problem. I think the most unanticipated dimension is the sort of mass withdrawal of Western companies from Russia that we've seen over the last week. Mass exodus. So just today, McDonald's withdrew. If you think about the symbolism of that, sort of the first up in Red Square and now pulling back. But every other sphere is covered too. Visa, MasterCard, Amex, no more Western payment systems in Russia. Even the oil majors, ExxonMobil that had been operating in Sakhalin, BP through thick and thin had stuck by their Russian partners, also withdrew, also Shell. These aren't necessarily sanctions related. They're to do with reputation, they're to do with capital controls, disruptions in supply chains. But again, this brings to the end 30 years of sort of this experiment of wondering whether integration to the global economy could socialize Russia to be more liberal or less authoritarian, and we have our answer. It has not. It has failed. On the flip side of that, we're seeing also these extraordinary measures to go after the so-called oligarchs, those who supported Putin at home, but were very happy to have second residences and all the luxuries of the West. And so we've seen the seizures of yachts of Sechin, Usmanov, by the French, the Italians, the Germans. The UK is having more problems getting its act together because it has an entire cohort of professional enablers in the city of London that have created this Londongrad. And of course, we have the joint task force here that's been announced. So all of that, I think, has been quite extraordinary. When we look at the non-Western part of the world, though, here the picture is more blurry. Let's not turn this into a narrative of sort of democracies consolidating to fight autocracies that's been put out there. The largest democracy in the world abstained on this question at the UN. And I agree with the ambassador that 144 votes criticizing, or condemning rather, Russia is a lot. But these 35 abstentions come from parts of the world that make up about half the world's population. On the other hand, we're seeing that because of the announcement today that the U.S. will no longer import Russian oil, we're having to cut some last-minute deals with some pretty unsavory autocrats. In Venezuela, have to cozy up to the Saudis again to get the taps to turn out. So these compromises are being made in the short term for that. Also, when you think about China's role here, abstained, are they trying to thread the needle? Some commentary, they can't have been too happy with Putin not finishing this off in 2 to 3 days the way they were promised. But China, if it threads the needle, is very well poised to come out of this. So while American Express and MasterCard are leaving, who's coming into Russia? UnionPay is on the Russian standard. They will now corner the payment systems in the country. And in general, Russia is going to be sold off at the fire sale to the Chinese. There's been all sorts of opportunities there as the ruble plunges in value. Also, a number of countries, especially in Eurasia, are terrified of all the uncertainty and consequences going on. Not only just the potential for Russia to come in a place like northern Kazakhstan and do the same, but also what this world of these extreme sanctions means for them. I had a conversation yesterday with a Central Asian ambassador who said just outright, Iran is sanctioned. We don't have a waiver the way the Indians do. We can't trade with Xinjiang. And now you're saying we can't trade with Russia. What do you want us to do? What are economic opportunities for a landlocked country? And so when you put that also in the context of rising oil prices, rising commodity prices, the potential for real social tumult right across Eurasia, but other parts of the world too are really elevated. So it's a work in progress, so to say, but history has certainly sped up in these last 10 days.
Well, that's an interesting prospect. But before we come to the future, I'd like, Steve, if you talk a little bit about actually how we get information about any of this. How do we understand how Putin may be looking at the world, what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, what matters to Eurasian government? I mean, how do we absorb information about all of this?
Sure. Well, before the invasion, when it seemed likely that one would occur, there was an awful lot of talk about a hybrid war, one where the information environment, cyber attacks, would be at least as important as kinetic military action. I think what we've actually had a war of a kind of neo-colonial classical dimension, tanks, armor, infantry, artillery, but the information war has been a big part of it. So to the extent it's hybrid, it's because of the information war. A colleague at the New Yorker calls it the TikTok war, and certainly the prevalence of viral social media distribution, the attempt to create viral distribution of both authentic and fake videos has been a major feature of the information environment. I would say, reluctantly from a journalist's perspective, that the social media environment, heavily polluted though it is, has been more important than the traditional reporting to the way the information war has played out. Both sides are very active, both to the extent we can see who's authoring the social media war. There are both state actors, familiar kind of adjacent to the state kind of teams, and then volunteers, apparently large numbers of volunteers. There's a lot of fake manufacturing of videos by volunteers and perhaps state actors on both sides. And from a journalist perspective, one of the things that journalism can contribute, has contributed, is verification. This has been a subspecialty of journalism practice. Going back to the Syrian war, I remember listening to a Reuters specialist in fake activist videos from the Syrian war, and his job, sitting on a desk, was for 6-8 hours at a time to distinguish false from authentic citizen videos by basically starting with the metadata on the video and going to the mountain ranges. He had a whole wall full of maps and satellite photographs to try to figure out whether something was where it was supposed to be. In terms of the traditional reporting on the ground, it's been very one-sided. Access on the Russian side, as President Bollinger described, has been deliberately cut off, both for Russian audiences and for global audiences. I think as journalists, we're trained to be skeptical about sort of conventional wisdom narratives, and I think there's reason to be skeptical about all of the interpolations about the failures of morale and logistics and dissent on the Russian side. Not that there isn't evidence of a failing invasion or a struggling invasion, for sure there is, but there's no independent reporting about the qualitative experiences of conscripts and officers, about why decisions are being made in the field by general officers, why the convoys are moving more slowly than some people anticipate. And you don't have to be a military historian to observe that in the course of conquering a country of 40 million people of the size of Ukraine, failing to do so in 13 days is not going to write you into history as a disastrous campaigner. So it's early. This is going to be a long and, I'm afraid, a very ugly war. And so the tendency that we all feel in the face of such a violation of international law and an outrage of human values and decency to want to associate ourselves with the victims shouldn't cause us to lose sight of our critical judgment about the facts of this campaign as they unfold. Again, it's very early. The last thing I would say, we were chatting about this before, about journalism practice. I mentioned the social media verification. In journalism generally, over the last 5 to 6 years, there's been a fusion between what newsrooms do and what NGOs that practice what's called open source intelligence do. So particularly the use of commercial satellite photography to document human rights abuses. The New York Times now has a visual investigations unit that's quite sizable and extremely talented. They do everything from harvest social media videos of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol to collect commercial satellite imagery before and after to show the burning of villages in places that would otherwise be difficult for reporters to access. And so this has been developing over years, and you can see it at work here. And it's a way to at least start to count things that we can see for ourselves and not rely on governments to tell us about KIA numbers. 12,000 is what the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense cites. And then I saw that the US today said, the intelligence leaders said 2,000 to 4,000 with low confidence. Anyway, the very last thing, if I could just add one note to this question of why it's so hard to understand Putin. Coincidentally, for the last 4 years, I've been working on a book about the run-up to the 2003 Iraq invasion from Saddam's point of view. And one of the new sets of materials are all these tape recordings. And he's been living in my head for 4 years. So what's remarkable is how the conventional assumptions about what he was thinking and what he was talking about with his colleagues are just completely divorced from what was actually happening inside the room. And it's just a reminder that these closed groups around autocrats with absolute power are they're just difficult to understand and penetrate. And so I think we should be very humble about our interpretation from outside.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have a quick now round of follow-up, more future-oriented. And again, I'm going to leave the last word to the ambassador. But Keren, how do you think, apropos trying to understand what's going on in, if you will, in the Kremlin or in the president's mind, if some of what Alex describes of a sort of fire sale to China and social tumult and so forth and so on, how would that be read by Putin? Would he absorb that? Would he understand that? How would that affect his approach to?
Right. So as we're kind of thinking about what's happening, there's kind of good news and bad news, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So with the humility in mind, I will tell you what I know, what I don't know, and what I think I know, right? We know that offense is harder than defense. And we know that consolidating power for him after he's bombarding civilians and the population will be extremely, extremely difficult. So we are likely going to evolve into more of an insurgency. And this can be very long and ugly and devastating. But it will unlikely to be able to, unless he's really incurring a lot of costs and putting many, more forces into it, it will be impossible for him to really consolidate to the extent that he wants. So offense is harder than defense. The bad news on our side is that compellence is harder than deterrence. And we've moved from deterrence is where you try to dissuade somebody from changing the status quo. Compellence is once they change the status quo, is really try to get them to roll back. And we know, both from research and from history, that that is really difficult. So that is the constraint that we have to work with. Everything that we've tried to do now in terms of deterrence, it failed. And what we're doing now, we are trying to compel by punishing, but it's going to take a long time. So it is hard to see how he will calculate the situation, but there are a couple of things that he will keep in mind and observe, right? One is his assessment about the strength and the unity of the alliances, of the Western alliances, right? So far, we surprised him with how quickly, how coordinated we were in terms of the sanctions, but it's not clear how he views how sustainable that is. There is some uncertainty when things will become harder at home, how this unity, to what extent this unity will remain as we move, as time goes by. China is another thing that he will keep in mind and is going to be important. The other thing that he's going to be monitoring is what's happening domestically, right? The sanctions, the coercive economic sanctions that we're inflicting on him are trying to achieve two things. One is to punish, and the other is to drive a wedge between him and the elites. And that is something that he will have to really monitor over time. Are the oligarchs staying with him? And at what point it's becoming dangerous? And then the question is in what way he's updating. Is he escalating, or is he becoming more willing to compromise? Then it's really his assessment of what the red lines for the West are. We've been really good in terms of coordinating the sanctions, but it's not clear that we're on the same page in terms of our red lines of when are we going to intervene beyond that. And that uncertainty for us also means uncertainty for him. And when there's certainty, there is a lot of room for misperception and miscalculation. And we haven't seen that. There is a debate about the no-fly zone. We've seen this in the newspaper. The defense establishment is we begin to see a debate about this. So the red lines for us are also something that he will look at, and then our willingness to support the insurgency. when we get to this, and how we're willing to do this. And then there is a lot of, if we're in that world of what we're willing to do, how much we're going to take the potential risk of accidents, unauthorized escalation, and so on when we are transferring weapons, military advisors, or whatever it is. So a lot to process, and again, with his level of isolation and paranoia, and the belief that he has to win this, unfortunately, it looks like it's going to get worse before we are seriously in a point where we can negotiate a settlement. And it's very sad. But.
Steve, were you surprised by how quickly and apparently successfully the Russian media landscape was locked up? My experience from living in quasi-totalitarian countries is that that's pretty much impossible. You can lock it up, but people know, and they especially know if the soldiers are dying. So I'd like to have a sense of what you think is likely. So let's assume that Keren's correct and this lasts for some time. It's hard to imagine that the Russian populace is not, in fact, going to know what's going on?
Oh, I agree with that completely. Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising that he was able to shutter the remaining independent media outlets, though they weren't terribly significant in the light of the Russian population. And he was easily able to get Parliament to pass this law that shuttered Western news organizations based in Moscow. But in this world, you can't hide the truth. And I think looking to the future, it's important for us to acknowledge in all of our discussions about the subtlety that there's a moral dimension to this war. And it is part of the reason why Europe rallied so unexpectedly. It's part of the reason why President Zelensky's videos go viral. And that moral dimension, Russians are going to feel the moral dimension of the war, much as they have felt in recent history the moral dimension of their own government's failures and crimes at home and particularly at home. So I think what this is going to do over time is to return both Russians and Europe to the question of Ukraine's legitimacy and its independence. And I don't think you can put that back in the bottle. I mean, I was stood on the border of, it's now North Macedonia, watching Kosovars flow out of their country. Who would have thought that Kosovo would be independent before Milosevic expelled the entire population? And today, Kosovo is a country, fragile one, but a country. And I think that the script is already written for Ukraine in the long run in a post-Putin world.
Thank you. On that note, Alex, tell us a little bit about the resources here as we think about Ukraine and its future here at Columbia, and then I want to ask the ambassador.
Yes, certainly. So I know my colleague and successor Valentina Izmarilova has been busy coordinating both with the global centers, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, to try and highlight programming that portrays Ukraine and their contributions to global society, not just as victims of this war. And of course, providing scholarships, fellowships for Ukrainian students at all levels is important. I would make an appeal to my colleagues in the professional schools. If you can incorporate Ukraine into your practicums or your research workshops, many universities are still functioning, but also we have this huge diaspora community and also this refugee population. I think the refugee crisis is something that we're well equipped to study and also to help out with. I would like to see possibly an internship program for undergraduates that focuses on helping Ukrainian refugees in all of these European countries there. But I think, one final thing to mention here is we were lucky enough to have a Ukrainian studies program set up here in the 1990s by Petr Yatsik. And Yatsik believed that to make something permanent, you had to endow it, you had to give it resources, because Ukrainian studies is a history of not being treated as a legitimate field, of being a field in exile, of being a field that had to maneuver within Russian studies and differentiate itself. And so I think here at Columbia, we're not only a global center for Ukrainian studies, but we have a special responsibility and obligation to keep it very much alive, but also to plan for the unthinkable. And so when we hear, this desire to sort of extinguish Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian nationalism, we have a duty to do everything that we can to make sure that does not and will not happen.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I think you've heard from your colleagues on the panel a commitment to sustain the study and support of Ukraine. Tell us what you think we should be doing.
Thank you. I fully agree with Professor Cooley that this is being done nowadays, and this has to be continued as far as the academic process is concerned. And looking into the future, I will follow what my colleagues have expressed. Well, first of all, sometimes the situation, today's situation, is compared to that famous or infamous Cuban Missile Crisis, which was solved by peaceful means, also because one of the parties, Nikita Khrushchev, didn't want any war. With all his criticism in his address, he was a peaceful man. Now, we have an absolutely different situation. We have a person who can do anything. And that's really a serious problem. What can be expected? I would really wish, and I like to expect, that the Russian people this time can show more, let's say, ability to fight for their rights. Because what's going on in Russia, it's a terrible mess. 15 years for imprisonment, for expressing the views that are not completely repeating the government's view. This is terrible. The demonstrations in 56 towns of Russia, the demonstrations against the war were held just now, and several thousands in Moscow this weekend. So I think and I hope that this time Russian people can do their job and not to repeat what unfortunately had happened in 2011 after, uprising on Bolotnaya, and that just was stopped. I think especially after all these sanctions start to work, the situation in Russia, economic, financial, political, will be terrible. Mm-hmm. And I also think that these guys, the inner circle, the so-called, or maybe a little bigger circle, can do their job, really, and finish up once and for all. There have never been military coups in Russia. Maybe the time has come for that. Well, then, the other thing is that the Russian people really, I think, have to do their job. And the last prospect is that we may continue with this war. There'll be, maybe some, it will sort of continue not at this level, at this ferocity as it is going on now, but we may be in for a longer period of war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank all of my panelists for an extremely illuminating conversation. I hope we can reconvene in 6 months and have a happier story. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.